The water was the color of old copper, the way water gets when something underneath it has been burning for a long time. I stood on the edge of the survey platform and looked at it. The rest of the team was 40 meters back, arguing about extraction vectors and safety thresholds. The Verk settlement coordinator was talking very fast in his own language. Director Oslin was telling him to slow down. Our translator, a young man named Bren, was looking between them with the expression of someone watching two trains approach each other on the same track. I was not listening to any of it. I was watching the figure in the water. She had been there for almost a minute. That was the detail nobody else had caught because they weren't looking at the water. They were looking at their maps and their readouts and each other. I was looking at the water because that's what field geologists do. We look at what's actually there, not what's on a screen. It's a habit so old I don't experience it as a choice anymore. My eyes go to the physical world first. Always. The copper-colored water of the Verk extraction basin was not supposed to have anything in it. It was listed on every hazard chart as a Class 7 prohibit zone. The Vethorn energy extraction process had saturated the basin over the past 6 years with bioreactive particulates, and the Council of 12 had cordoned it off and left it alone, the way you leave a wound alone when you don't know what caused it. The water glowed very faintly at night, Bren had told me. Not in a beautiful way. She had been in that water for almost a minute, and she was going down. I didn't think about it very hard. I pulled my rebreather off my kit belt, bit down on the mouthpiece, and jumped. The water was warm. That was the first thing. The second thing was that it was heavy, not thick, not exactly viscous, but dense in a way that pressed on you differently than normal submersion. Like the liquid had weight of its own, not just gravity but something intrinsic to its chemistry, some property of the particulate load that changed how it responded to displacement. My boots hit something soft at the bottom, a sediment layer, silicatrich by the feel of it, and I pushed off it and came up oriented slightly wrong, but I found her on the third kick. Her outer garments had pulled her down. The Verk wear layered silicate weave fabric that absorbs moisture and becomes very heavy, and she had 3 layers of it on. Full formal dress, I found out later, which made no sense until it did. I got her under the arms and pulled. She didn't fight me, that was something. Panicking people fight you and fighting people drown faster. She went limp or close enough to it, and I got us both to the surface and then to the platform ladder in about 30 seconds. It felt longer. Things always feel longer in the water. Bren was there. He helped me get her up. She was the most striking person I had ever seen in person, which is not the relevant fact at this moment, but it is true. The Verk looked like humans in the way that a drafted architectural sketch resembles a finished building. The proportions are familiar, but the details are wrong in ways that take a few seconds to catalog. She was taller than me by a head, and her skin was the gray-blue of deep slate, and her eyes, when she opened them, coughing that heavy water out of her lungs, were the pale yellow of old glass. Her hair was matted against her skull in dark ropes. She had a scar that ran from her left temple down to the corner of her mouth, thin and silver, the kind a surgical tool leaves rather than an accident. Not a wound, a procedure, something that had been done to her with precision and afterward. She looked at me. I looked at her. She said something in Verk. Bren was very quiet for a moment. Then he translated, which was his job, though he looked like he wished it wasn't at this particular second. She says you should not have done that. She was drowning, I said. Another exchange. Bren's expression did not improve. She says she was aware of that. Director Oslin appeared at my elbow. He was a compact man who had spent 20 years doing corporate extraction work and had the face that produces the look of someone who has made too many decisions where the math did not work out cleanly on the human side and has learned to do the math anyway. He had good shoes that were completely wrong for field work. I had never understood that about him. "Rourke, what exactly have you done?" "Got her out of the water," I said. You went into a class 7. She was in it too. He looked at her. She was sitting up now, her palms flat on the platform, breathing steadily. She had a way of sitting that made her look like she was conducting an inspection, like the platform was something she was evaluating and had not yet rendered judgment on. "Who is she?" I asked Bren. Bren asked her. She responded at some length. He translated in pieces, with pauses that suggested he was deciding how much to relay and in what order. "Her name is Thessaly Venara. She was a Vethorn research coordinator. She is one of the people who designed the original extraction process for this basin." He paused. "She has been in a council detention facility for the past 4 years. "For what?" I asked. Bren asked her that too. She looked at me when she answered, not at Bren, like she was speaking to me directly, and Bren was the mechanism by which she happened to be doing it. "For arguing," Bren said, "that the extraction process was going to destroy the basin, and for trying to stop it anyway after the council told her not to." The sky above us was the color rust gets when the rust is very old. It had been that color since we'd arrived on this world, which was 11 days ago. Bren said it had been that color for 3 years. The Vethorn extraction process had released something into the upper atmosphere, a particulate load that scattered the light wrong, filtered out the spectral bands that made the sky the color it was supposed to be. The Verk called it the caravan, which translated literally as the covering. Their astronomers couldn't see their stars anymore. They had adapted to it the way organisms adapt to things they cannot change, which is to say they had rearranged their mythology to explain it and their architecture to account for it and their poetry to mourn it. I found all of that out later. At the moment, I was standing in copper-colored water up to my knees and trying to understand the situation. What I found out then, standing on a contaminated basin platform with a woman who had been imprisoned for 4 years for being right, was that Director Oslin had recognized her name. "Venara," he said. His voice had a particular quality, not surprise exactly, but the sound a person makes when a name they've seen in documents becomes a face. He spoke to Bren in a quick, low-register voice, and Bren spoke to her, and her pale yellow eyes went to Oslin's face and stayed there with an expression I couldn't read yet. I would learn to read her expressions eventually. At that point I had known her for about 7 minutes. I had been on enough extraction jobs to recognize a negotiation beginning. The specific kind where one side has something the other side wants, and the exchange rate is the only question, and everyone is pretending the conversation is about something else while they establish what it actually is. I didn't know yet that I was the instrument of something older than corporate negotiation, something the water itself had already decided. I would figure that out in the morning, when a council delegation arrived at our camp and asked to speak to the human who had pulled Thessaly Venara from the water of the Vethorn Basin. And the way they asked it, the precise phrasing, which Bren translated very carefully, his voice unusually neutral, was not asking to speak to a person who had performed a rescue. They were asking to speak to the person who had performed a commitment. There is a word in Verk that has no direct translation, Vethshan. Bren explained it to me that morning while the delegation waited outside the camp perimeter. He explained it carefully, with the particular deliberateness of someone who is aware they are delivering news that will significantly alter the recipient's day. The Vethorn, the energy source, the mineral compound that Thessaly Venara and her team had discovered 40 years ago, was not just a chemical process. The Verk do not separate the physical from the relational in the way humans do. They do not have a concept of a resource that exists independently of everything around it. Everything that exists in Verk metaphysics exists in relation to everything else, and that relation is not incidental. It is part of the nature of the thing itself. A stone is not just a stone. It is a stone in relation to the substrate it rests in relation to the water table beneath it, in relation to the hand that lifts it, and that relation is part of what the stone is. The Vethorn Basin was saturated with living mineral particulate, reactive, aware, in the way the Verk mean aware when they use that word about non-biological material, which is to say, responsive, capable of encoding relational information in the way that magnetic media encodes signal. Not conscious, not thinking, but recording. When I jumped into the water to pull Thessaly Venara out, I had entered a body of liquid saturated with encoding-capable particulate. The liquid had recorded the event in its structure. Specifically, it had recorded the relational fact of the event, one entity choosing, without compulsion, without calculation, to enter risk in service of another entity that had not asked. The particular's species, cultural context, whether the chooser understood the water they were entering, were not part of what the particulate recorded. The particulate recorded the bare relational fact, the choice made visible by the action. The Vethorn particulate had registered this as a Vethshan, a declaration of account, of consequence. In Verk cultural law, which was older than the Council of 12 and considerably older than the extraction consortium that had paid to devastate the basin, a Vethshan performed in a living mineral medium was a binding act. The medium witnessed. The medium held the record, and the record had legal standing. It was, Bren told me, somewhat apologetically, the closest thing in Verk tradition to a marriage proposal, except that it was less conditional. Proposals could be refused. A Vethshan performed under living mineral witness existed regardless of whether either party would have chosen it if they'd known what they were doing. There was going to be a ceremony. I sat with this information for a while. Bren waited. He had a gift for patient silences. It was probably why he was a good translator. "Does she know?" I asked eventually. "She was the one who told the delegation," Bren said. I sat with that for a longer while. I looked at the rust-colored sky through the camp mesh and thought about a woman who had just spent 4 years in a concrete detention facility for being correct about something important, and who had gone into the copper water of the basin she'd spent her life studying, and who had told the council delegation before I had been informed. I thought about what that sequence of facts meant. I didn't come to a firm conclusion, but I thought about it. The council delegation stayed outside the camp perimeter for the better part of the morning. I could see them through the mesh, 5 people in layered gray garments, very still, the way the Verk go still when they are either angry or very patient. It was often difficult to tell which. In this case, I suspected both simultaneously, which seemed like a valid emotional state given the circumstances. Director Oslin found me at the geology rig at 1100 hours. He didn't look like someone delivering good news, but he also didn't look like someone in active crisis, which meant the news was in the complicated middle zone. "The delegation has legal standing," he said. "The consortium's planetary access agreement was negotiated under full Verk cultural framework. That includes tradition law. All tradition law, apparently, including provisions that weren't specifically flagged in the compliance briefings." "I know," I said. I had been reading the briefing documents that nobody reads. The ones that cover cultural compliance because they're required to, and everyone files and nobody opens. When you spend enough time in this kind of work, you learn that the unread documents are usually the ones that matter. "Rurk, the situation is." "She was drowning," I said. He pinched the bridge of his nose. "I understand that. I'm not suggesting you should have. If you were going to suggest that I should have let her drown, I'd appreciate you not finishing the sentence." He didn't finish it, to his credit. There was a long pause. He looked at the rig, and at the rust-colored sky past the camp perimeter, and at the distant shimmer of the basin. The basin had its own quality of light, copper and faint, like light that had traveled a very long way and arrived diminished. Like something was absorbing it before it got to you. "What do you want to do?" he asked, which surprised me. Aslan was not a man who typically opened that door. He was more of a "this is the situation" man, a "here are the available options" man. The "what do you want" formulation was outside his usual register. I thought about it. "I'd like to talk to her," I said. "Venera, if she wants to talk." She did. They brought her to the camp's mediation space, a modular room with a curved table and 4 chairs and very bad lighting, the kind of neutral space that extraction teams carry for exactly these moments in the early afternoon. She looked less waterlogged than she had on the platform. She had changed into dry Vert clothing, a single layer in dark gray, and her silver scar caught the light when she turned her head. She had done something with her hair that made it lie flat rather than rope knotted. She sat down across from me and put her hands on the table, flat, deliberate, the same gesture she'd used on the platform, and looked at me with those pale yellow eyes and waited. Bren sat off to the side. She spoke, he translated. She says she doesn't require anything from you. She says the Vethshan is a matter of record, but that she is not a person who would enforce a matter of record against someone who acted without understanding what they were entering. That's generous, I said. Another exchange. She says it is not generosity. She says you could not have known. She says the basin encoding mechanism is not public knowledge. The council suppressed her research that documented it, along with most of her other research on the basin's long-term behavior. The research about the extraction process destroying the basin, I said. Bren asked. She responded. Something in her face shifted when she spoke, not softened exactly, but the rigid quality of it changed, the way stone changes when it takes on water. Not weakness, a different kind of structure. The research about all of it, Bren translated. The long-term particulate saturation of the atmospheric layer, the bioreactive encoding of the water table. The viral cascade that she predicted would begin when the 3rd extraction ring was opened. He paused, looking at his tablet. She says the 3rd ring was opened 8 months ago. I had read about the viral cascade in the medic's hazard briefing. It had an official designation, Vethorn Particulate Syndrome, VOPS, and an official status of emerging concern, under investigation. The kind of language that means we know it's bad and we're calculating how bad before we announce it, because the announcement has consequences we're not ready to manage yet. Is she sick? I asked. Bren asked. She looked at me for a moment before she answered. Not long, just a moment, like she was deciding how much of the answer to give. Yes, Bren said, early stage. She says the detention facility is close to the extraction ring. She says most of the people in the facility have it. I said something that I won't repeat here. It was not professional. She watched me say it, and her expression indicated she understood the sentiment without needing a translation. She says you are unexpected, Bren said after a moment. I'm a geologist, I said. We're not usually surprising. That got a response that was longer than the others. Bren took a moment with it, reading back over it on his translation tablet. She says that in her experience, the humans who come here are people who are only here for the rock. She says you seem like someone who notices the things around the rock as well. The water the rock sits in. The sky above the rock. The people whose basin the rock has been taken from. I notice what's there, I said. That's the job. She said something short. She says that is rarer than you would think, Bren said. We talked for 3 hours. Bren's voice got increasingly careful, the way it does when a person is translating something they're genuinely interested in translating. She explained the Vethorn Basin to me in terms that were part chemistry and part something else. That relational quality the Verk have, the way they describe the physical world as if it has an interior life, as if every substance has a relationship with every substance around it that is part of what it is. She talked about the 2 mineral compounds, stellene and scalt, that the extraction process combined to produce the Orion energy. She talked about what happened when the ratio was wrong and the combination became unstable. She drew with her finger on the table's surface, diagrams, cross-sections, pressure curves, and she drew them fast from memory, without hesitation, the way you draw something you've been carrying in your head for a very long time. I recognized some of it. I'm a geologist. I've spent 17 years looking at the way elements interact inside planetary bodies, at the way reactive compounds behave under pressure, at the way substrate composition changes when you introduce a stress at the wrong point. Some of what she was describing mapped onto things I had seen in terrestrial mineralogy. Not identical, the Verk compounds had properties that don't exist on Earth, that came from a planetary chemistry that had evolved completely separately over billions of years, but related. The way pressure propagates through a saturated substrate. The way reactive minerals encode environmental history in their crystalline structure. The way a cascade failure begins not at the weakest point, but at the point where accumulated stress finally exceeds the substrate's capacity to distribute it. The third extraction ring, I said. Where exactly is it? She looked at me and then looked at Bren and said something with a particular quality. Not suspicious, exactly, but careful in the way careful people are when they've been burned by sharing information before. She wants to know why you're asking, Bren said. Because if it's a pressure cascade, the vector matters. It's not going to spread evenly through the substrate. It'll follow the grain structure and the particulate concentration gradients from the source. If you can identify the leading edge of the spread, you might be able to intervene at the distribution points rather than chasing it everywhere at once. Bren translated. She was very still for a moment. That Verk stillness that I was learning to read, not absence but processing. The expression of a mind moving very fast through something. Then she began drawing more diagrams. I didn't sleep that night, I worked. She had given me 11 years of suppressed research in 3 hours. Not all of it, not the complete documentation, but the framework, the structural logic of it, the part you need to understand a problem before you can start addressing it. The Vethorn viral cascade was not a biological disease, exactly. VOPS wasn't caused by a pathogen in the traditional sense. It was caused by the bioreactive particulate entering the respiratory system and binding to living tissue, the same encoding mechanism that made the basin water register my jump as a Vethshan, but in a continuous low-level exposure that accumulated over time. The body didn't recognize it as foreign in the way the immune system recognizes a virus or bacterium. It was more like the particulate rewrote some of what it touched, slowly, at the cellular level, making tissue behave like the mineral compound itself, brittle in some ways, differently responsive in others. The Verk medical authorities had no good treatment because they were approaching it as a biological problem. They were looking for the pathogen, looking for the infection vector, looking for an immune response to support or a replication mechanism to disrupt. None of those things existed in the form they were looking for, because this wasn't biology. It was mineralogy expressing itself in a biological medium. I know what I'm good at. By 300, I had a working hypothesis about the cascade vector. By 500, I had a rough method, a way to address the source rather than the symptoms. It was crude. It was adapted from terrestrial techniques that had never been applied to Verk mineral chemistry. It had not been tested on Verk biology or Verk substrate in any controlled setting. I was a field geologist working from an incomplete secondary briefing on an alien world's mineral chemistry in the middle of the night with no laboratory access. But it was something, and something was more than what the Verk medical authorities had, which from what Thessaly had described was an official stance of continued investigation while the case maps expanded. At 600, I went to the mediation space and asked Bren to find her. She arrived looking like she hadn't slept either, which I suspected was true. She had a particular quality of alertness that comes not from rest, but from having been thinking hard without interruption. I recognize it because I have it myself most mornings. There were things she'd said the previous day that I kept turning over, the particular flatness of her voice when she talked about the detention facility, the careful way she declined to mention specific people she had known there by name. People go flat like that when they're rationing themselves. When they've learned to keep a door closed on certain things, because opening it costs more than they can afford right now. She sat down. She looked at my calculations on the tablet. She picked it up and turned it over to look at the back of it, which made me realize she was checking whether it was a physical tablet or a projection. They use projections mostly. Then she set it down and read the screen. She asked Bren something short. "She asks if you've slept," he said. "No," I said. Something passed across her face. "She says that's very human," Bren translated. "Is she saying that as a compliment or an observation?" I asked. Bren asked her. "She said something." "Both," he said. I walked her through the hypothesis. She understood most of it immediately, and the parts she didn't, she understood after one clarification, which told me that her mind worked in a way that went very fast and didn't waste effort. She pushed back on two of my assumptions, correctly, specifically, with the kind of pushback that shows you someone is engaging with the actual argument rather than a version of it they've flattened, and revised a third in a direction I hadn't considered but which made immediate structural sense once she explained the property of the Scalt compound I'd been mischaracterizing. I revised the hypothesis. She revised it again. Her revision was better. By 900 we had a working model. It was provisional and it required field testing, but it had internal logic, and it was grounded in the actual mineralogy of the basin rather than a generic approach. At 1000, Director Oslin came to find me and told me that the consortium's legal team had confirmed the cultural compliance situation, and that the delegation was prepared to proceed with whatever formalities were required. And what exactly did I want to do about the overall situation? "I'm going to need resources," I said. He looked at the tablet with the working model on it. He looked at the calculations. He looked at me for a moment in the way he looks at things when he's deciding whether to ask questions or just authorize. "This isn't the extraction job," he said. "No," I said. He looked at the rust-colored sky through the window for a long time. I could see him doing the math in the way he does, not the geological math, the other math, the kind that has people and liability and future contracts in it. He ran it in that quiet way of his, and it came out somewhere. "What kind of resources?" he said. There's a specific quality to an extraction team when they've been told to do something that wasn't on the manifest. A mixture of resentment and interest, the way people get when the job changes in the middle of it. Resentment because plans create their own kind of gravity and altering trajectory costs something. Interest because a new problem is a new problem, and people in this line of work generally got into it because something in them responds to new problems. That's the hidden thing about extraction work. The people who last at it are the ones who find it genuinely interesting. Not the money, or not just the money. The actual work of arriving somewhere and figuring out what's there. I had 5 people on my survey team. Hendricks, who was my second and who was going to be annoyed at me for at least 2 days but would be completely functional the whole time, as he always was when he was annoyed. 2 junior surveyors, Mala and Prex, who were young enough to find the whole situation interesting rather than alarming, and who had been quietly but visibly thrilled by the cultural development since yesterday. Our equipment manager, a woman named Tag who had been doing this longer than anyone, and had the serene quality of someone who has seen too many situations to be surprised by new ones, and who, when I explained what we needed the georemediation tools for, simply said which configuration and began setting up. And Bren, who was technically the translator but who was a chemist by training, and who, once I explained the full model, became very invested in it in the way chemists become invested when they recognize a problem that is in their domain and has been mischaracterized. Thessaly came too, obviously. Without her, the field work was guesswork with borrowed tools. With her, it was adapted methodology from someone who understood the substrate better than any of us. The council delegation objected to this. She was in their custody, or had been, technically, before the ceremony question created a parallel legal status that the delegation was still working out. Oslin spent 40 minutes in negotiation with them and came out looking tired in the specific way he looks when he has won something at a cost he's still tallying. They'll allow it, he said. 2 of them will accompany the team, as observers. He paused. And they want the ceremony process to begin before the team deploys. Today, I said. A preliminary registration, he said. The formal ceremony can follow, but they need the Vethshan formally acknowledged before she leaves the camp with the team. Acknowledged by whom? I said. He looked at me. By me, I said. Yes, he said. I thought about this for a moment, about what it meant to acknowledge something, not to complete it, not to commit to everything it implied, but to acknowledge that it existed, that the water had recorded something real. All right, I said. The preliminary registration took 40 minutes. It involved a cultural clerk with a crystalline data tablet and a stylus that looked older than the legal framework it was implementing, and a great deal of very precise language, all of which Bren translated with unusual care. At the end of it, Thessaly, Venara and I both had small marks on our left wrists, applied with a mineral compound ink by a tool that was something between a medical pen and a calligraphy instrument, hers in dark gray and mine in the same color. The marks were the same character in Verk script, rendered in a shorthand form that Bren said indicated preliminary rather than complete. The character meant witnessed, provisional, a record of the fact that something had happened, held open for what came next. She looked at her wrist when it was done, and then at mine. She said something quiet, just to me. Bren translated without being prompted. She says it suits you, he said. I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything, which she seemed to read correctly, because she didn't look like she was waiting for a response. The third extraction ring was on the south side of the basin, accessible by a track that the consortium's initial survey team had cut through the silicate scrubland 18 months ago, and that the scrubland had reclaimed. We drove for 2 hours through vegetation that had a quality I'd noticed when we first landed on this world, an almost architectural quality, as if the plants were growing according to a plan. The branching patterns were too regular. The angles of the secondary growth off the main stems were consistent, in a way that organic randomness usually isn't. Later, riding in the vehicle beside Thessaly with Bren between us, I asked about it. She explained without looking away from the window. The Vethorn particulate in the soil had worked its way into the chemistry of the endemic plant species, not killing them, not exactly, changing the expression of their growth hormones in a way that made them responsive to pressure gradients they could sense in the substrate through their root systems. They were growing toward lower stress regions and away from higher stress ones. The architecture was a map of the pressure distribution in the ground beneath them. I looked out the window and tried to read the map. I couldn't yet, but I was learning the language of it. The 2 council observers, a man named Varl and a woman who hadn't given her name in a form Bren could easily transcribe, rode in the second vehicle and didn't speak to us. The sky stayed that rust red. The sun was visible but wrong, like a light behind dirty glass, giving illumination without warmth. Hendricks leaned over to me at one point, his voice low. You want to tell me what we're actually doing out here? Mineral substrate analysis, I said, and targeted remediation of a reactive particulate cascade that's been misidentified as a biological pathogen. He looked at me for a moment. He has a very specific look when he's processing something that's outside his expectation range, but not outside his competence. So we're fixing their planet. We're trying to slow something that's going to continue spreading and kill a significant number of people if it isn't addressed at the source, I said. With geology tools. With geology tools and the help of the person who designed the original extraction system and spent 4 years in a concrete room being right about what it was doing to the substrate. He looked out the window at the architectural scrubland. What do you need me to do? The extraction ring was enormous in the way that things built to be enormous remain enormous, even when they're decommissioned and cracked. The ring structure stood 12 meters at its tallest point, concrete and metal construction that had been poured and bolted together over the course of 2 years, and then operated for 4, and then shut down and abandoned in the way. Things get abandoned when they cause more problems than they solve, and the people who cause the problems find somewhere else to be. The ring had cracked in 2 places along its northern face. From one of the cracks, a thin seep of copper-colored liquid ran down the foundation wall and pooled at the base in a depression that had probably been an equipment drain before the structure was operational. The liquid glowed, not dramatically. Just a faint internal light, the color of old firelight, the color of something that had once been energetically alive and was now running down. Thessaly stood at the edge of the pool and looked at it for a long time. She had her arms at her sides and her hands slightly open, not a fighting stance and not a grieving one but something between them. I stood next to her. Bren stood slightly behind us. Her family's settlement was about 12 kilometers north, Bren said quietly, even though she hadn't said anything yet. He'd been around her long enough to anticipate. The consortium's initial survey displaced it before extraction began. Standard resource zone clearance. She would have been perhaps 15 years old. I looked at her. She was still looking at the pool. Then she said something. She says it was more beautiful than this when she was small, Bren translated. The stellene deposits in this region produced a mineral crystalline structure in the exposed rock faces that caught light differently from ordinary stone. She says when she was very young, before the covering, when the sun was right in the late afternoon, the whole basin floor used to look like it was full of stars. Not metaphorically. The stellene would fracture light into spectra that the eye read as moving points of light, like looking down at a night sky. She says that is why she became a research coordinator for the extraction project when she was recruited. She thought that if she was part of it, she could protect it. The rust-red sky had no stars in it, hadn't for 3 years. The covering didn't just flatten the color. It prevented the specific spectral refraction that the stellene deposits produced, the same property that the Verk had read navigation and season and meaning into for generations. The stars in the basin floor had gone out before the stars in the sky above it. I looked at the seeping crack in the extraction ring. I looked at the pool. I looked at the pressure-following plants in the scrubland behind us. Tell me about the crack, I said to Thessaly. She told me about the crack. It had appeared 6 months ago, after a seismic event that the consortium had logged as minor, a 2.3 on their scale, well within the operational tolerance parameters that had been filed with the Council. What the parameters hadn't accounted for was the way 4 years of particulate saturation had changed the mechanical properties of the substrate surrounding the ring foundation. The encoding particulate altered the crystalline structure of the rock it settled in, made it more responsive to vibration. Not weaker, exactly, more precisely tuned. The seismic event hadn't needed to be major. The substrate was already listening for something to respond to. The viral cascade is venting through this crack, I said. She confirmed this. The bioreactive load in the seep water was 3 times the concentration of the basin average. The seep was feeding into the groundwater table, and the groundwater table flowed north and east in the direction of the prevailing substrate gradient, which is exactly the direction the VOPS case maps had been expanding, which nobody had noticed because nobody had looked at the substrate maps and the medical maps together. Hendricks was already pulling equipment from the second vehicle. Tag was moving with him, reading his intent without needing to be told. The juniors were setting up the monitoring array. The method we'd worked out was adapted from terrestrial sulfide ore remediation. In high-reactive sulfide mining zones on Earth, when you get seep acid drainage from a cracked containment structure, you introduce a counter-reactive agent at the source, typically a buffer compound that binds to the acid-generating minerals and neutralizes the reaction before it enters the groundwater. You don't try to clean the groundwater after the fact, at least not first. You stop the source from generating. On this world, the counter-reactive compound was scaltalone, pure, without the stellene. When the extraction process combined the two compounds, the interaction generated the Orion energy output but also destabilized them both. Scaltalone, uninteracted, was chemically neutral in the basin environment. Better than neutral, it would bond with the suspended encoding particulate in the seep water and interrupt the reactive charge that made the particulate bioactive. Render it inert. Stop it encoding. The trick was the concentration gradient. Too little scalt and the reaction would continue. Too much and you'd change the substrate chemistry in ways that were hard to predict. Thessaly worked out the concentration. I watched her work and understood maybe 60% of what she was doing in real time, and the rest became clear as she showed her work. She moved through the numbers the way she did everything fast, without wasted motion, from a place of complete familiarity with the material. She'd been over this in her research. She'd calculated this version or something close to it already, in theoretical models, in the suppressed papers, in her head during 4 years of detention. She had known what would fix this. She had known before anyone else admitted there was a problem. She had just not been in a position where anyone with the tools to implement it had been willing to listen. Mala and Prex set up the injection equipment at the seep point. The consortium's georemediation tools were designed for different purposes: standard environmental compliance, technically, which is the polite name for don't make this worse than it already is, but the delivery mechanism was the same. Tag supervised the setup. Hendricks ran the pressure calculations independently to cross-check. We began the injection at 1400 hours. It was not dramatic. This is true of most meaningful work in the field. It was Hendricks watching gauges and Tag adjusting flow rates and Bren translating Thessaly's real-time corrections as she read the response indicators on her equipment. The copper color of the seep water lightened incrementally over the course of 3 hours. The internal glow diminished. By 1700, the seep water ran nearly clear. The Verk observer, who hadn't given her name, took a small sampling tool from her garment and dipped it in the clear water and waited for the reading, and then looked at it, and then looked at the man named Varl. She spoke. Bren was standing close enough to hear. He translated without being asked. She says the bioreactive index is within safe range, he said. He paused. She says this is the first reading in the safe range she has seen from this location in 8 months. Nobody on my team said anything. We are not a group that performs reaction. We looked at our equipment and we looked at the clear water and we moved on to the next thing because that's what you do. Thessaly said something, short, almost flat, the voice she uses when she's keeping the door closed. She says thank you, Bren said. I looked at her. She was looking at the extraction ring, at the now clear seep, at the pool that no longer glowed with that tired internal light. Tell her we're not done, I said. There are substrate gradient lines from this site that we haven't addressed. The seep was the source, but the cascade has been running for 8 months. We need to trace the affected groundwater pathways and do secondary injection at the distribution points where the particulate has already spread. Bren translated. She looked at me. She said something that wasn't thank you and wasn't a technical response, a different quality to it. She asks why you are doing this, Bren said. She says, he paused, choosing the translation carefully. She says the extraction contract doesn't require this. She says she has some experience with what extraction contracts require. I thought about how to answer that. Tell her it's a pressure cascade, I said. If you can identify the vector, you can address it. That's the whole job. You don't stop when you've found the source. You trace it out and you close the pathways. Otherwise, you've done half a job. Bren translated. She looked at me for a long moment. In the late light, with the rust-colored sky going darker at the edges, her gray-blue skin had a quality like old stone at dusk. The kind of stone that has been in the same place for a very long time and carries the memory of everything that has happened to it in the mineral layers. She said something. She says, Bren translated quietly, that she has been telling people about the vector for 11 years. I know, I said. She says that no one on this world looked at the rock to find it. I'm looking at it, I said. She looked at her wrist, at the gray mark there, the preliminary witnessed. Then she looked at mine. Then she picked up her equipment and started toward the substrate scan points she'd identified on the way in, and I followed her, and the team followed me, and that was how the next 3 days went. We worked through the gradient lines. There were 7 primary distribution pathways from the 3rd extraction ring into the surrounding groundwater table, which was more than I'd estimated, but exactly the number Thessaly's models had predicted. We hit each one. The scalt injection concentrations had to be calculated individually for each site based on the local substrate composition, which meant Thessaly running calculations, and me cross-checking them against terrestrial analogs, and both of us being wrong about different things at different sites and correcting each other. It was good work. The specific kind of good work where the problem is hard enough to be interesting, and the stakes are high enough to matter, and the person you're working with understands the problem from an angle you don't, so the collaboration produces something neither of you would have found alone. Hendricks caught me looking at her during a calculation session on the 2nd day. He was pointedly not smiling. You want me to pretend I didn't notice that, he said. Yes, I said. Done, he said. On the evening of the 2nd day, the unnamed Verk observer sat down across from me at the camp table with Bren and spoke for a long time. She was, it turned out, one of the senior medical authorities on the council. She had a name, Counselor Verkan de Ris, and a title that translated roughly to Minister of Living Systems, which was the Verk equivalent of a public health position. She had been among the people who had dismissed Thessaly Venara's research 11 years ago. She said this directly. Not apologizing. The Verk formal language doesn't contain that construction in quite the same way English does, but acknowledging it. Stating it as fact on the record, with the particular weight the Verk give to things that are spoken formally and on record. She said the readings from the secondary injection sites were consistent with the hypothesis. She said the VOPS case progression maps, when overlaid with the substrate gradient lines we'd traced, aligned with a precision that the Council's medical models hadn't achieved in 8 months of trying. She said the Council's medical authorities were going to need to revise their understanding of the condition significantly. I said that the primary author of the relevant research, including research that predated the medical authorities' models by a decade, was sitting in the tent next to mine and had documented all of this before anyone listened. Bren translated. The counselor looked at Thessaly's tent for a moment. She spoke. She says the council will be requesting Dr. Venara's participation in the revised framework, Bren said. Formally, officially. I looked at Bren. She used the title, he said. Doctor. It was revoked when she was detained. The counselor used it. Later that night, Thessaly said something when I passed her tent on the way to the monitoring equipment. She said it without coming out, just from inside the tent, knowing I was there by my footsteps. Bren was nearby but not right there, and she said it in the mixed language we'd been building across 4 days, the technical Verk words I'd picked up and the English framing she'd started using for the structural parts of our exchanges. She said, "You noticed what was there." I stopped. "I noticed what's there," I said. "That's the job." She didn't say anything else, but through the tent wall I could hear the sound of someone finally sleeping. The ceremony happened at sunrise, 4 days after I pulled her from the water. I had been uncertain about it in the way you're uncertain about things you cannot fully evaluate because you lack all the variables. The Vethshan was a Verk tradition, old and specific, and I was human. There was something about claiming its weight that felt like it needed examining. Not refusing it, the water had recorded what it recorded, and I wasn't interested in disputing what I'd done or why I'd done it, but examining whether it was mine to stand inside. I brought this to Thessaly the night before. I didn't have the language for it in any Verk I'd picked up, so I needed Bren, and I explained it to Bren first, which was an unusual conversation. She listened to the translation and was quiet for a moment. Then she said a great deal, carefully and in order, with the quality she brings to things she has thought about thoroughly. She said that the Vethshan didn't require cultural membership. It required the act. She said that what made it binding was not the medium, not the particulate-saturated water, not the basin, not the Verk tradition, but the choice. And the choice was not in dispute. She said she had been thinking about this since the afternoon on the platform. She said what struck her was not the jump. People jump sometimes for various reasons. What struck her was that when she looked at me from the water, I had been looking at the water, not at my teammates, not at the argument behind me, at what was actually there in the basin, and that when what was there turned out to include a person drowning, I had acted on what I saw. She said that was what the water recorded, the looking and what followed from it. She said she had spent 11 years in a field where the job required looking at what was actually there, and where the people with authority over her had consistently chosen to look at other things. She said she was not unaware of what it meant that a human field geologist from an off-world extraction contract was the first person in that 11 years to look at the same thing she was looking at and arrive at the same place. I sat with that for a long time. The ceremony was not large. It was me and Thessaly, Venara and Bren and Counselor Duris and 2 other council representatives and Hendrix, who stood to one side with his arms folded, and the expression he gets when he's witnessing something he's going to be telling stories about until he retires. Mala and Prex were nearby. Tag was there, as she tends to be when things matter. The Verk cultural format for formalizing a Vethshan involved a confirmation reading from the basin water, which carried the record of the act in its particulate structure, and which the officiating clerk translated into ceremonial language in a voice that had the cadence of something being read aloud for the last time, because after this it would be known. The language was formal and specific, which is the way important things are in Verk. They don't abstract them into metaphor. They say the concrete thing clearly and let the weight of the concrete thing do the work. It involved an exchange of commitments, which Bren helped me translate into terms I could speak accurately and without saying anything I wasn't certain of. Not sweeping promises. Specific commitments that I could stand inside, to keep looking at what was there, to act on what the looking showed, to not treat the rock as if the things around the rock didn't exist. Simple things, the simplest things. The rust-red sky was turning lighter at the eastern edge as the star came up. Not much. The covering was still there. It was going to take years to clear, even with the remediation work we'd begun, and there was more remediation work ahead than behind, and none of it was simple or funded or certain, but lighter than it had been when we started. She had her hand extended toward me, palm up, which is the Verk gesture of the ceremony moment. Open hand offered, not reaching, not grasping, just there with the gray mark of witnessed on the inside of her wrist. I put my hand in hers. Her grip was strong. The gray blue of her skin was beautiful in the early light, I thought, in the way old stone is beautiful, not despite the fact that it's been weathered and changed and marked, but because of it. Because it carries where it's been in its surface. Because you can read what happened to it in the grain. She said something, just to me, not to anyone else, quietly. Bren translated anyway, from a few steps behind us, because that was his job and he was good at it, and I think he knew I'd want to hear it properly. She says she would like to show you what the basin looked like before the covering. She has documentation, spectral records, light distribution maps, every measurement her team took in the first years of the project. She says it is very beautiful. She says she has never had anyone to show it to who would understand what they were looking at when they saw it. The light was growing, not the full-spectrum light that had fractured through the stellene deposits and filled the basin with what looked like a sky turned upside down. That was going to take time, years of remediation and clearing and waiting. But something. Light coming through at angles the covering had been blocking. "Tell her yes," I said. Bren started to relay this. "She understood," he said instead. "You said it before I could translate." I looked at Thessaly. She was looking at me with those pale yellow eyes, the ones that went with the scar from a precision instrument and 4 years of being correct in a concrete room, and the hands that had drawn diagrams on a table to show me where the vectors were. She looked like someone who has been carrying a very precise and heavy knowledge for a very long time, and has finally found somewhere to set part of it down. 8 to 15 years, I said. She knew what I was referring to. Yes, she said, the English came out cleanly, she'd been practicing it. I'm not in a hurry, I said. She didn't translate that, she understood it directly. The sun continued to rise behind the covering. The basin caught what light it could. The clear water at the seep site, running clean now, safe range reading, the first in 8 months, caught the light differently than the copper water had, reflected it instead of absorbing it. She kept hold of my hand. I noticed what was there. Then I kept looking. That's what the job requires. You identify the vector. You trace it out. You close the pathways one by one. You don't stop in the middle because the work is harder than the manifest suggested. You don't pretend the things around the rock aren't there because acknowledging them is complicated. The water had recorded a choice. I wasn't going to dispute the record. In the basin below us, in the particulate-saturated water that was slowly becoming something better, the Vethshan held. The medium witnessed. The medium remembered. Humans are good at that too, in our own way. We don't always have living mineral water to put it in. But we remember. There is something specific that happens when you work alongside a person who knows a subject more deeply than you do. It is not the same as working alongside someone who is simply faster or more experienced in your own discipline. It is closer to working alongside someone who has been living inside the problem, while you were learning to read about it from the outside. They have an interiority to the knowledge that you don't. They know where the edges are because they found the edges themselves, in real time, with real consequences. Thessaly Venara had spent her entire professional life inside the Vethorn Basin problem. She had found most of its edges by walking into them in the dark. The suppressed research files she described to me contained not just the correct models and the correct predictions, but the record of finding them. The failed approaches, the revised hypotheses, the data she'd had to gather secretly in the last 2 years before her detention, because the council had revoked her official access. The record of someone running the full investigation alone, without resources, in a situation where the people with resources had decided they didn't want to know what the investigation found. I thought about that record on the second morning, watching her work at the substrate monitoring station we'd established near the 5th gradient distribution point. She was calibrating the flow sensor with a precision that came not from the instructions for the equipment. She'd never used this exact equipment before, but from understanding what the equipment was measuring deeply enough to know what it needed to be told. It is a particular kind of competence, the kind that transfers. The kind that doesn't live in a specific tool or a specific setting, but in the understanding of what things are and how they work. You can take it anywhere. Someone tried to take it away from her, and they couldn't because it wasn't a credential or a title or an access authorization. It was what she knew. Bren found me watching her. He said without me asking anything, "In Verk there's a word for this, what you're doing." "Looking," I said. "No," he said. "That's the verb. There's a word for the state of doing it, of looking with the intention to act on what you find. Most human languages don't have a single word for it. They separate the looking from the acting. The Verk consider that a strange way to divide things." "What's the word?" I asked. He said it. It was a soft compound word, 3 syllables, with a shape that felt like it fit together. "What does it mean?" I said. "Exactly." "It means," he said, "being in the world in the way that what you notice becomes part of what you do." I looked at Thessaly, working at the substrate station with the careful attention of someone who is in the world exactly that way. "That's a good word," I said. He said something in Verk to her across the distance. She looked up. She said something back. "She says you're using it," Bren said. The substrate station was recording clean readings by the end of the second morning. The 5th gradient pathway was clear. We packed the equipment, marked the site coordinates for follow-up monitoring, and moved to the 6th. The work continued. That is the part that matters and the part that doesn't make for a dramatic narrative, which is why I'm not going to stretch it into one. We closed the pathways. We documented the substrate response. We handed the model and the documentation to Counselor Duris and told her which monitoring cadence to maintain and what concentration adjustments to make as the substrate chemistry stabilized over the coming months. Thessaly reviewed everything before we handed it over and made corrections in 3 places and additions in 2, and signed it with the mark that had been on her wrist since the preliminary ceremony and was now permanent. Hers in dark gray ink, mine the same. Witnessed complete. We stood at the edge of the now clear basin pool, and I looked at the water and at the rust-colored sky, and at the woman standing beside me who had known the whole shape of this problem for 11 years, and I thought about what it means to find the vector. Not just the geological one, the kind that runs through time, through suppressed knowledge and locked rooms and wasted years, and one moment of clear cold water and an unexpected choice. You find it, you follow it to where it leads. Then you keep looking.